I want to primarily, I think, tell you about the fish that I did my research on, because I found the 3-4 years in which I was doing that research at Birmingham were absolutely fascinating. I was fascinated by this particular fish, and I hope I can convey something of that excitement and interest and enthusiasm tonight. So that'll just be fun and interesting, I hope. So it's a collection of my own stories, I think, more than anything. So there's no particular theme. The talk's not really going anywhere in particular. I've got far more material, I know, than I'll... What time should I stop? That'd be a good thing to know at the moment.
Well, you've got about 45 minutes.
45 minutes, okay. So stop about, what's that, about 8:45? Yeah. Right, okay. Right, so what I was going to say is I've got far more material than I could possibly cover in that time. So I'm just going to sort of ramble on, as it were, I hope interestingly, and when we get to that sort of time, we'll stop. So as I say, there's no particular theme, it's not particularly going anywhere. If there is anything behind it all, perhaps you could say it's response to a common criticisms often made, and that is that if you reject the sort of naturalistic approach to science, if you're a theist or a Christian in your approach to science, then somehow that's going to be a science stopper and you're not really a scientist. Well, I've always had that approach. As I said, despite the university knowing that, they still allow me to do research, and having put me really through the mill in terms of evaluating that research, decide that I'd done more than enough to get a doctorate. So if anything, this talk is partly an answer to that question, to say, yes, you can be a theist, a Christian, and that doesn't stop you doing good science. Okay, in fact, I'd put it a lot stronger than that, but we'll leave that for the moment. Okay. So first of all, just some more background. I first really encountered the issue of origins, creation, evolution, call it what you like, in the middle of the 1960s. At that time, for those of you who can remember back that far, there wasn't really very much literature. I mean, if you go out today into Christian bookshops or even secular bookshops, you will find a wide variety of books on the origins issue. In secular bookshops, you'll find plenty of the intelligent design movement literature. You go to Christian bookshops, you'll find, again, a huge variety of literature, lots on a theistic evolution approach, lots on a more creationist approach, and everything in between. There's an abundance of literature. Back in the 60s, there wasn't. There was, in fact, very little indeed. And so if you were a religious believer, a Christian, and wanted to find out what Christians, scholarly Christians, thought about the topic, there really wasn't terribly much to read. And I found most of what I did read fairly unsatisfactory for all sorts of reasons. Particularly probably that I'd really started to get into the literature in the history and philosophy of science, which really was entering its modern period at that point in the sort of late 50s, early 60s. That was when the work in history and philosophy of science really took off in the Western world, with people like Karl Popper, then Thomas Kuhn, Paul Feyerabend, and many others coming along. And I really got interested in that and reading it. And that was the main thing I found, that most of the literature I was reading in Origins was simply ignorant of or ignoring that literature, and was really putting forward indefensible positions, particularly when they looked at the history of scientific theories and the evaluation of them. So anyway, to cut that story short, in 1965 I went up to Birmingham University, determined to find out all I could about this whole origins issue, to read biology, and with the hope that I'd eventually be able to go on and do some kind of research in this area in biology. Right. But before we go any further, we need to be clear about definitions, because words like evolution or creation or origins, are capable of just so many definitions. And part of what goes wrong, I find time and time again when I give talks, is that I and the audience are so often working with different understandings and different definitions. So just to be clear, what I'm referring to as evolution. And two meanings, I'd say, are crucial to the debate. That when commonly in the secular world, and this is true from Darwin onwards, evolution means two prime things. It means universal common descent, so it's amoeba to man, particles to people, kind of evolution that we're talking about. And then a naturalistic framework, the assumption that nature, physical nature, is all there is again very much there in the picture. Now, when people talk about evolution today, when Richard Dawkins, for example, talks about evolution, those two features are implicit in what he's talking about. And anyone who rejects those is automatically beyond the pale. So for many of the secularists, a good Christian theistic evolutionist is just as much beyond the pale as, say, a six-day creationist. For those who are really committed to naturalism, it really doesn't matter. They don't make the kind of distinctions that perhaps a Christian might want to make. Just say that there is another meaning commonly used for evolution, which is, I describe as a distractor. And that's the idea evolution just simply means variation. And so commonly I find when I give talks that people in question time will come up with all sorts of evidence of variation in animals and plants and say, how can you possibly deny this? Aren't you an ignoramus? Or even worse than that. So just to say that is a distractor. Nobody on any side has ever doubted that there is variation. In fact, it's just as much a part of creationist frameworks as it is of evolutionist frameworks, and always has been. And if you want evidence of that, you've only got to read Darwin's own introduction to The Origin of the Species, where he freely admits that and quotes, practically all the scientists of his age, even though many of them strongly disagreed with his theory. Nevertheless, they were all equally committed to a belief in variation. The point about Darwinism and evolution is that it doesn't simply say that there is variation, but there is no taxonomic limit to variation. Variation can go as far as you want it to go. That is the fundamental belief that we're talking about. Not just variation itself, but there is no limit to it. That's what the secular framework, Darwinism, assumes. And just to go back to about naturalism, one can give endless quotes on this from everybody up to Dawkins and on. But I choose this particular one because it was in a letter to the Kansas Academy of Sciences in 2005, and it's distinguished because it was signed by no less than 38 Nobel laureates. Evolution, they wrote, is understood to be the result of an unguided, unplanned process of random variation and natural selection. That's where I say I wish there was much more understanding of history and philosophy of science, because that is a philosophical statement. It's not a scientific one. It's not one for which science could ever, give any decisive evidence. But anyway, that's a statement. That's the kind of statement you commonly find. And so it's worth emphasizing that Darwinism, and Darwinism is what is normally meant when people use the word evolution, for both its original author, for Darwin himself. Darwin was an absolutely committed naturalist, in the sense of belief in naturalism. As you can see if you read his letters and all his correspondence and notebooks. So both for Darwin himself and for all the leading modern proponents, Darwin is the naturalistic theory of evolution. So universal common descent and naturalism are what I'm referring to when I use the term evolution. Incidentally, do you recognise all the figures there? Who's top right? Yeah, John Maynard Smith. Bottom left? Yeah, Daniel Dennett. Middle bottom? Yeah, Steve Jones, a geneticist from London University. And bottom right. Anyone not know? Richard Dawkins. Okay. One of the first things I did when I was doing my research, was to really go into the history and philosophy of science, and in particular the history and philosophy of evolutionary science. And immediately discovered, as you went back into that history, that evolution has got just as much a religious root as, say, any creation theory. Because so often what I come up against is that the idea that evolution is science, creation or any other kind of origins belief is religion. Well, when you look back in history and see where evolution came from, how it developed historically as a theory, of course, long before Darwin, then you find it had a very religious origin. And it's always existed down through Western history for at least 2,500 years as the idea that there is a great continuity in space and time, what was often called the great chain of being. But the idea behind that idea of great chain of being was the idea that the only way we can have a rational understanding of the world is on the assumption that it has a unity and an order. And the only way it was thought that that could be if somehow behind everything there was a great continuity, that everything was linked to everything else. Everything in the end was ultimately one. Really, it's a bit of an incoherent idea. I'd say it's really actually an irrational idea. But nevertheless, that was how it was passed down from the ancient Greeks right the way down through history. And Darwin was very much aware of that tradition and very much identified with it. And he and most of his generation talked about the principle of continuity, which is not a scientific principle, but just simply this idea that the whole of reality is some kind of genealogical continuity. And that principle of continuity, as they called it, was seen as the only possible naturalistic basis for reason and science. And to this day, you'll find many a scientist, totally unaware of where the idea comes from, talking about this or that must be so because of the principle of continuity. Well, if you come across that kind of statement, and it's very common in books and papers and articles, then beware the fact it comes from this tradition. There is no such scientific principle. It's a philosophical assumption. So Darwinism, in reality, equals naturalism plus rationalism plus evolutionism. Evolution, the idea of continuity. Rationalism, the belief in reason. Naturalism, belief that nature, physical nature, is really all there is. And I must put up there are loads of quotes one could give from scientists today, but this famous one from Richard Levant, I'm sure someone must have put it up before at one of these meetings. It's not that the methods and institutions of science, he wrote, somehow compel us to accept a material explanation for the phenomenal world, but on the contrary, that we are forced by our a priori adherence to material causes to create an apparatus of investigation and a set of concepts that produce material explanations, no matter how counterintuitive, no matter how mystifying to the uninitiated. Moreover, that materialism is absolute, for we cannot allow a divine foot in the door. I have great respect for Richard Levant because he is impeccably honest about his assumptions and commitments. And if there's time, I'll give some further quotes from him later on in this talk, not about evidence as such, but in other areas too, where he is far more honest in terms of the evidence than many other scientists. And, in distinguishing what is his commitments and assumptions and what are empirical findings. So I have great respect for him in a way that I haven't for people like Dawkins. Anyway, that's all just background to what's coming next. Oh, yes. Just a few just other points. Another thing that I wanted to test out in doing my research was the fact that there are actually two foundational laws in biology. If you do biology courses at university, they're not likely to be presented as such, despite the fact they clearly are. And those two laws are the law of biogenesis and the law of heredity. The law of biogenesis, of course, is simply the law that living things arise only from other living things. It's a very simple law, and yet it's been confirmed by billions of people as far back as history goes, and no one has ever come up with any exception to it, even though, as we know from the history of science, numerous people over recent centuries have professed to find exceptions to it, but it's always proved not to be the case. Of course, there's been a lot of research on the origin of life, and without summarising that, again, I think you have had talks on that, haven't you, here? So just to say that all the origin of life research has bequeathed us abysmal results and seemingly insurmountable problems. Most experiments have been done, though it's not really very well reported in the literature, but most experiments just simply produce a mixture of very red complex oils and black tars, black or brown tars, is essentially what you end up with, not with the molecules of life. The second one is the law of heredity, that living things not only arise only from other living things, but always from other living things of the same kind. And again, despite all the research, all the experiments, all the investigations, again, no exceptions to that have been found either. You can breed as many varieties of cats as you like, but you still end up with cats. You can breed as many varieties of dogs as you like, but you still end up with dogs. Or E. coli, or species of bacteria, or roses, or cabbages. It doesn't matter what organism you take. However, the wonder and diversity of the varieties that you produce, you still end up with fundamentally the same kind of organism. And I say those two laws are the most rigorously tested and confirmed in the whole of biology. Almost, I can say, in the whole of science. Well, except perhaps that the fact the sun rises and sets every day probably has even more evidence for it, but you know what I mean. We'll skip those. That's just repeating the same thing again. Oh, just a quote from, as bacteria are the ones which have been subjected to more experimental treatments and more breeding experiments than anything else, we've probably gone through thousands of generations of some bacterial species. And yet, Alan Linton could write a few years ago in the THES, he's a professor of bacteriology at Bristol, retired now. Throughout 150 years of the science of bacteriology, he wrote, there is no evidence that one species of bacteria has changed into another. And I can say, it wouldn't particularly bother me if one species actually had changed. That's a kind of variation that wouldn't particularly faze me. But even so, he concludes not even that has been found, observed, or demonstrated. And behind that, though, again, it's a topic I don't want to cover tonight, is the whole idea of information. That the kind of changes and variations that we're talking about in a Darwinian framework involve the creation of thousands, millions, even billions of bits of new information. And yet, stubbornly, there is no evidence that natural processes can generate large amounts of new functional information. Functional structures in biology, particularly molecular structures, turn out to be tiny oases in vast deserts of non-function. And no naturalistic mechanism have yet been discovered that can cross those deserts. Again, science and evidence of this sort is such that one can never say that you can prove or disprove anything, but the very least I'd want to suggest that a theory like Darwinism that lacks that kind of crucial support can hardly be regarded as a robust theory. But that's background. I want to come now on towards my actual fish, which are the delight of my heart. But when I first started working on my cichlid fishes, and I'll say more about them in a moment, I did some preliminary research. I thought, well, one ought to just have a look at the fossils and just see what the evidence is for the evolution of this particular group of fish. I'd also, by that time, found out that the university had appointed as my external examiner Dr. Humphrey Greenwood, who happened at that time to be assistant director of the Natural History Museum in London. So I had a dual purpose for going up to visit that museum as much as possible. One, because they had the greatest, and still have, the greatest collection of fossil fishes in the world. And also, of course, I wanted to get to know Humphrey Greenwood and find out as much about him as I could, as any self-respecting PhD student will do. And so I started to look at the fossils of fishes and spent many delightful hours with Humphrey Greenwood looking at the fossil fishes in the British Museum. It was a very interesting time because this, I say, was back in the late 60s, early 70s. And there were two key people at the British Museum, Natural History at that time. One was Humphrey Greenwood himself, who, of course, was a secularist evolutionist but sceptical about Darwinism. Also at the museum at that time was a guy called Colin Patterson, who also was involved in the fossil fish collection and also was an evolutionist who was sceptical of Darwinism. So I had some very interesting conversations while I was looking at all the fossil fishes. But what I found was, quite clearly, and they both agreed with this, fossil fish belong clearly to existing fish kinds, kinds of fish that are still alive in the world today, or to equally distinct kinds which are now extinct. But missing links are missing. And I actually put this statement pretty much in those sort of words in my doctoral thesis. And not very much to my surprise, that was immediately picked up in the viva. And my internal supervisor asked Humphrey Greenwood, who was my external examiner, what he thought of my making this statement. And I was quite astonished, but impressed by his honesty, that he replied that he thoroughly disagreed with that statement, but he had to recognise that he could not, in all honesty, point to any fossils in his collection, or any other collection that he knew of in the world, to contradict the statement. And therefore the statement must be allowed. So I've been very fortunate in my history to be up against people who, however much they disagree with me, are at least, got incredible integrity and honesty. And I made a mental note that I hope I would never, to people I disagree with, be any different. But then that led me on to another question. If that's the picture those fossil fishes give, is that simply because the fossil record is incomplete? And if you look in textbooks and the literature and popular articles, you'll endlessly come across statements that say that extinct species represent 99% of all species, 99% of all species that ever lived are extinct, or even 99.9, or 99.99, or 99.999. In other words, it's assumed and written everywhere that most species of organisms are extinct. And that only 1 in 100 to 1 in 100,000. And most scholars go towards the higher end of those figures are there. So the fossil record, therefore, they assume, is very incomplete. And if you take the normal sort of tree of life, you can see why they make that assumption. And it is an assumption. As we'll see, there is no empirical evidence for it whatsoever. That statement, which you commonly find, given all the times, if it is a fact of science, is nothing of the sort. It's just an assumption. An assumption because of this. If that's your tree of life, then, of course, the area I've enclosed in that red oval are, of course, all the extinct species that make up the trunk and the branches and the smaller branches. The living species are represented by all the outermost twigs of that tree of life. Well, you've only got to look at that picture to see the proportions. Obviously, the tiny ends of the twigs, the living species, are only a minute percentage of the whole tree. So if that evolutionary picture is anything like correct, then the vast majority of species and organisms must be extinct. And that's the assumption which is made. And all the statements you find in the books are simply a result of that assumption and nothing else. What's happened here? Now, how can you check that assumption that the fossil record is very incomplete? Well, practically the only empirical way that you can do that is to check how many living species are actually also found as fossils. So how well represented as fossils are all the species that we know alive in the world today? And typically, I found when I researched it that 40 at the lowest end to 80% of living species, 80% plus in fact, of living species are found as fossils. So actually living forms are well represented in the fossil record. And not just in recent strata, some of them go back a long way in the fossil record. In fact, just in the news this last week was of the recent discovery of a horseshoe crab fossil, over 400 million years old on conventional dating. And yet its representatives are still alive in the world today. For genera of plants, so that's for species. Species are often not that easy to recognize in fossils, particularly fossils are very fragmentary. So I prefer to go for genera in plants and families in animals, which are actually the categories that most people recognize as distinct kinds of animal, distinct kinds of organism. And if you take those categories, genera and families, then the figures are typically 80% and above, often pretty near 100%. Now that's true even for poorly represented groups. In the late 1990s, I checked all the fossil data available at that point and found even for the birds, which are regarded as one of the most poorly fossilized groups there are, nevertheless, 88% of bird families were also known in the fossil record. And here's a typical example. This is actually an old table, so these figures are actually out of date and need to be substantially increased. And you see, if you look at the bottom, where it says terrestrial vertebrate families excluding birds, well, as I've just said, the latest figure I have for birds is near 90%. So actually you don't need to exclude birds. But as you can see, where we take families, genera, or species, it really doesn't make any difference. Living forms are incredibly well represented as fossils. Typically 70, 80, 90% representation. So do we have empirical evidence that the fossil record is incomplete? No, in fact, we do not. It really is a Darwinian assumption. And incidentally, following from that, because what people are interested in when they talk about fossils are extinct organisms, when you pick up a book about fossils, typically, of course, you'll be looking for and expecting to find a lot of description about trilobites and dinosaurs, and mammoths, and everything like that. And so, of course, that's what all the books on fossils give you. And that gives a completely false impression. If those books of fossils were actually to concentrate on those fossils which are most common, then, of course, the book of fossils would be pretty much the same as a book about the living world. Because the vast majority of fossils are of animals and plants which are still alive in the world today. I mean, remember that diagram before. If evolution is true, then we would expect fossils of extinct organisms to incredibly outnumber living organisms. In fact, it's completely a way around. There's reckoned to be something in the region of 30 million living species of animals and plants. The total number of known fossil species, extinct species, is of the order of a few 100,000. Living species, living genera, living families outnumber the extinct ones. And I say in terms of species, by about 10 to 1. So again, the empirical picture does not fit the picture that's expected at all. So that was interesting sort of background. But now let's come to my actual fish, cichlids. And for those of you who haven't a clue what I'm talking about yet, let me tell you what they are. There's some in the region of 32,000 living species of fish. That's every kind of fish, not just bony fish, goldfish, and carp and perch, but also sharks and rays and creatures like that. The cichlids are one of the largest groups of fish. There's about 2,000 species in about 200 genera. And in fact, they're the third largest vertebrate family. I mean, families in biology are roughly what most people regard as a distinct kind of organism. So the cats are a family, the dogs are a family, horses are a family, and so on. Well, the cichlids are the third largest vertebrate family. Only the cyprinid fishes, that's carp and minnows, and the gobies are larger, and not by much at that. And there's perch-like ray-finned fish. And the importance for this talk is that they're commonly regarded as showing evolution in action as one of the key proofs amongst fishes that evolution is true. So just then quickly to give you some examples so you know what we're talking about. One of the most important cichlids are the tilapias. This is a genus, tilapia, and there are many species of them, and they're important food for fish in Africa, much of Africa, and in much of the Middle East. Jesus would have eaten them, for example. And here's one of the typical tilapias, a Sea of Galilee tilapia. A bunch of them on a fishmonger's slab, and then how they look if they've been nicely prepared for food. They're very tasty. Though I must admit, I never ate any of the ones I kept, but haven't eaten them elsewhere. They're very tasty. And for those of you who know your Bibles, the story in St. Matthew's Gospel, chapter 17, about the fish in which Peter found a coin, which Jesus told him to go and catch and use the coin to pay their temple tax. That was almost certainly would have been a tilapia, because these fish, they use their mouths to dig nests in which to lay their eggs. They then brood their young in their mouths, and the story is that when the young start to get to the size where the mother no longer wants those young cramming into her mouth, she'll fill her mouth with a stone or pebble or coin to keep them out. So whether it's from just their normal digging habit or from the fact they would carry stones or suitable objects to keep their young out when they're getting too big, either way, traditionally this is thought to be the fish in question. So that's tilapia. There are also some game fish, and this one, cichla, the pike cichlid, can grow up to 3 foot or a metre in length, and really is a pike-like animal. It's the pike of the Nile and much the Middle East. And then for those of you who keep tropical fish, then you'll certainly know of some of the favourite cichlids. The angelfish, the discus, blue discus and red discus there, two of the most beautiful aquarium fish that you can come across. And they grow up to 8-9 inches a foot, even in size, so they'd be quite a good size. Convict cichlid, smaller, these are more in your sort of 4 to 6 inch range, but form fantastic pairs in which they lay their eggs, terrific courtship behaviour, and guard their young. So fascinating aquarium and very easy to breed and keep. But my personal favourite is the Oscar, a very pugnacious looking fish, as the name suggests. Grows up to about a foot or more in length. In fact, some of them grow up even larger than that. The largest I had was about a foot. And despite their pugnacious looks, quite gentle fish, form wonderful pets, got real characters. You can really have fun with them. And I had one looked much like this one. And I used to go to a local convent where I had an arrangement because I'd found that the local convent had chicken runs. They bred lots of chickens. And if you dig in the floor of a chicken run, you find the most wonderful juicy worms, which my fish absolutely loved. So every fortnight I'd go along and dig over the floor of these chicken runs to collect the worms. And this Oscar in particular really loved these worms, and I would sort of hold the worms over the tank and drop them in, and he would catch them. And then one day he couldn't wait and poked his head out of the tank and grabbed the worm before I could drop it in. So I thought, So the next time I held the worm above the water to see what would happen, and sure enough, he jumped out of the water to take the worm off my fingers. Now, actually, if you think about it, that's quite a feat for a fish, because when the fish is looking under the water, of course, light bends at the surface of the water. And so where he saw the worm was not actually where it was. And yet he was able to correct for that, because quite infallibly he'd always take the worm neatly off the end of my fingers. And so I kept holding the worm higher and higher above the water. And I eventually had him jumping well over a foot out of the water to take the worm off my fingers. Until one day, he got a bit too excited. His tank, I should say, was a large tank, but it was on the third tier of a row of tanks. I had about 30, 40 tanks in the zoology department at Birmingham's Aquarium. In fact, I had all their tanks at that point in time. And this is right on the top rear, about 6 foot off the floor. And one day he just got too excited and jumped and missed completely. He'd never done it before. He missed and went flop 6 foot down onto the floor. Now, any normal fish would have knocked itself out. He didn't, amazingly. And, flipped his huge muscular tail and went hopping around the floor. And it took about 10 minutes or more, I think, for me to catch him, by which time his fins were shredded, a lot of his scales were missing, and he looked a very sorry sight, and I really thought that I was going to lose him. But put him back in the tank, but found he was amazingly resilient. It only took him about a couple of weeks to regrow his fins back as new, replace his scales, and he looked as good as new. And he lived for at least another 2 years while I finished my research, and then I gave him to Bristol Zoo. And so his descendants are probably still there for all I know. But he would never jump for worms again. So fish have memory. He never forgot. He would never jump again. But another interesting, in 2005, I think it's January 2006, perhaps some of you remember it, because it was in all the papers and on the BBC News, that some shopkeeper in Lancashire somewhere, I think it was Oldham, had this Oscar, and the local Asians, local Muslims, thought the markings on its side actually spell Allah in Arabic. And on the other side, the markings spelled Muhammad in Arabic. I'm afraid my Arabic is not good enough to really check on that. But anyway, this fish was a great celebrity for some time. So that's another occasion when you might have heard about cichlids. Okay, that gives you some idea of what we're talking about. The distribution is very interesting. They're freshwater fish on the whole, found in Central and South America, the West Indies, Africa, the whole of the Middle East, Madagascar, and Sri Lanka and southern India. So that's enormous distribution. And one of the interesting things is when I started my research, I was told by all the literature that these were strictly freshwater fish, which was interesting because obviously there's a lot of ocean between those places, and they're tropical fish. So, there's no hope of going north or south and perhaps getting across some way. So that immediately raised the question for me, how did the cichlids get that distribution? Now, if you're an evolutionist, then of course you will have exactly the same question. How did those fishes get that kind of distribution from wherever they originated? But evolutionists, of course, will assume that there will be some families that have evolved amongst fishes which may be completely strictly freshwater because they've never been in anything else. But if, for example, you're a Christian who believes that at some stage in Earth's history there's been a universal flood, then of course during that all the waters will presumably have got well mixed up. And so you've got a double problem. How did freshwater fishes get spread out? So anyway, I had a look in my cichlids and started testing them all to see how many of them could survive in salt water. And I found that several of them actually could. And this one in particular, Hemichromis, the jewelfish, which is found in Africa, I found it would quite happily live in pure seawater. And at the end of my research, it and its mates and its young, in fact several generations, have been living in seawater for more than 2 years without any harm whatsoever. And in fact, I found that since, in reading through the literature, there are quite a number of cichlids which can survive and live in seawater and in fact are found on the coast and even out to sea. And so I certainly hypothesise that, as in this family, I would expect in every family of fish, whether they're supposed to be strictly freshwater or not, there will be at least some members of that family which can adapt to and live in seawater. And that, in fact, seems to be the case. So that's just another interesting thing. Just on size, cichlids vary enormously. The dwarf cichlid there is about just 1 inch in size, full grown, whereas the pike cichlid, as I mentioned before, grows up to about 3 foot in length, a yard, a metre. What distinguishes cichlids is 2 things in particular. They have an incredible variety of jaws and teeth. Unlike most fish, they don't seem to just have the normal jaws with their teeth. They have plates in their throat, pharyngeal plates, which are not fixed but are movable. So in effect, they have 2 sets of jaws, a front set with teeth and a back set with teeth. And between the 2 of them, that gives enormous versatility. And cichlids have adapted to a phenomenal variety of diets. And here's a particular fish, I think it's one of the tilapias, and you see how it's grazing the algae off rock, and so it's got those chisel-shaped teeth, which can quickly remove the algae. Where something like cichlids, predators, chasing fast-moving fish, has got those very pointed teeth with which to grab and hold prey. But you find amongst cichlids a tremendous diversity. Here are those from Lake Malawi in Africa. There are fish with the jaws and teeth adapted for eating fish scales and fins, for baby fish and eggs, for mollusks, for eating small fish, eating insect larvae, and so on and so on and so on. Tremendous variety. In fact, one scholar wrote that the variety of teeth in cichlids is so enormous, it dwarfs practically the whole of the existing vertebrate variation in teeth. You find enormous variety in just this one family of fish. And if it wasn't that we know otherwise, these different cichlids would be put in a vast array of different families, so different are their teeth and jaw structures. And yet, they so clearly belong as just one family. In reproduction, some of the fish are substrate brood. That means they lay lots of eggs, usually hundreds, on a surface, which may be just simply the top of a flat rock, or some like to hang their eggs on the roof of caves. And so in fish tanks, if you provide them with a flower pot, they'll lay their eggs on the roof of the inside. Others are mouth brooding. That is, the eggs are laid, and the female usually, but sometimes the male, will take the eggs into their mouth to brood them and keep them safe. And even the young will be kept in the mouth if there's any danger of threatening as well. Incredible behaviour of these fish, nothing like goldfish. And then thirdly, there's a sort of in-between variety where some of them will lay their eggs, but when they hatch, they then take the young into their mouths to keep them safe until they're well grown. And so just to picture it, those are convict cichlids again, shown substrate brooders at that point looking after their young, which are swimming around them. And then the mouth brooders. At the top, you've got the flock of young fish, the mothers calling them to her. Middle picture, you see them squeezing into the mother's mouth to get away from the danger. And then the bottom, you just got a picture of the mouth very cleverly taken when she was breathing, showing all the young crammed into the mouth inside. Very interesting to think about how that kind of behaviour involved, remembering these are fish that eat small fish. And here they are brooding safe with the egg and youngs in their mouths. So fantastic behaviour, fascinating fish. Then you keep tropical fish. No cichlid keepers here. Oh, you're missing something. You're really missing something. And they don't make messes like cats and dogs. They don't ruin your furniture. As I say, they're absolutely fascinating. And evolution in action, because particularly in Africa, most of the Great Lakes of Africa have huge numbers of these cichlid fish with just incredible variety and variation. Often what are called species flocks, where you get large numbers of these fish swimming together, not just one species, but lots of species all mixed together in incredible variety and profusion. And, surely this is evolution in action. But two pictures. On the left-hand side, you've got the fishes, cichlids from Lake Tanganyika, and the other side from Lake Malawi. And just shown in both lakes, independently, you've got very similar species which match each other in their varieties and adaptations. That leads me on to the points I want to make. On the face of it, that looks like, incredible adaptive variation, evolution in action, all the rest of it. But two things to say against that. The first is the fact that if evolution is true, the one thing you'd expect as a naturalist, in the sense here of one who's looking at animals and plants in the wild, you'd expect that as you increase your experience of any particular group of animals or plants, that you'd expect the boundaries to start to become blurred, and that you would not find distinctiveness. Exactly what Darwin expected. He expected that as you investigated nature, so you would find that the boundaries are blurred and that all species eventually merge into others, because surely they've evolved. And if all the links in that chain of life were there, you would not be able to make sharp distinctions. And yet the fact is, and I found this is true when I talked to other scholars, when I read the literature, that every botanist, every zoologist who has ever investigated any group in depth has always found the same thing. That the more they investigate a group, the more they find that their awareness of it becomes more and more distinct. And they don't find any difficulty distinguishing their particular group of animals or plants from the neighbouring groups. They just do not find blurred boundaries. They find distinct kinds. And that's something which I think probably is very much missing today, because although probably more biologists in the world today than there have ever been, yet of course most of those biologists are actually varieties of geneticists, or particularly of chemists and biochemists. Not many biologists today, a very small proportion, actually work in the wild with living animals and plants. And so that experience, which was so common in the previous generations, is not so well known today. And I showed this particular fish because I found that after working with these cichlids for a couple of years, I could go into a pet shop anywhere and just catch a glance out the corner of my eye of a fish and know instantly whether or not it was a cichlid. And I particularly had experience with this particular fish. It's a fish called Etroplus. It's the variety of cichlid found in Sri Lanka, which is perhaps the most different kind of cichlid there is. And I'd never seen this fish, but I went into a pet shop in Birmingham that I hadn't been in before, and they had a large number of aquaria and tropical fish. And just at the corner of my eye, I saw this fish. And I don't know how to this day, but I knew instantly that is a cichlid. And again, talking to other scientists, other groups of animals, they have exactly the same experience. If you ask them to write down a paper how it is they know that an animal is a member of the group, their investigation, they just probably wouldn't be able to tell you. Yet somehow there's something holistic about it that shouts cichlid, or wherever the group happens to be. And that was my experience. I could just infallibly tell what was a cichlid and what wasn't. Just from a glance, from yards away in a tank, I knew. But the other thing, the much more important thing, was to find that the more I investigated the cichlids, and what I did was actually keep as many species as I possibly could and then ransack the literature and start to tabulate all the different varieties and characteristics that the cichlids have and their distribution. And what I found throughout this group was mosaic patterns of variation. That is, all the tremendous variety, those 2,000 odd species, were actually created out of a relatively small number of character states. In other words, there are only about 4 different colour pigments found in cichlids. There are only about 12 basic patterns in which those pigments were distributed. But those 12 patterns and 4 colours, of course, give endless permutations. And that's essentially what you found amongst the cichlids. They just endlessly permutated those colours and those patterns in different ways. But what looked like an incredible profusion was actually built on a relatively small amount of variation. And what is more, the same patterns occurred at random throughout the distribution. For example, I mentioned that some cichlids lay their eggs by attaching them to the roof of a cave. Now that means those eggs are actually different. Normally a cichlid egg is just sticky all over when it's first laid. And so whatever it's laid onto, it sticks. So if it's top of flat rock, it sticks to the top of flat rock. But those cichlids which attach their eggs to the roof of a cave, the eggs are not sticky all over. They just have a sticky rod at one end, which they pop onto the roof as they lay it, and of course it sticks. Now cichlids with that particular adaptation of the egg, well, there's a species with that adaptation in South America, there's a species in Africa, a species in the Middle East, and a species in Sri Lanka. And that, what I found, was absolutely typical. The same variations were occurring like that all over the range, and it was impossible to trace any evolutionary lines of descent. You just had random permutations throughout the range of a relatively small number of characteristics. Nothing new seemed to be being generated anywhere, even those teeth variations. The same variations in teeth were cropping up all over the place. And again, I found when you look at the literature, that's exactly what you find in every group of animals and plants. That same kind of mosaic distribution of variation. Evolution or creation. Organisms just drawing endlessly on a common pool of variation, which they all have access to in one way or another. Let me tell you an interesting story. I told you that some cichlids lay their eggs on the ground and just look after them in a normal way. Others brood them in their mouths. Well, science would probably never think of doing this, but people who keep aquarium fish and all the journals and magazines they write for, of course, think of doing all sorts of weird and wonderful things. So, of course, numerous aquarium keepers have thought the idea, what happens if you swap these over? What happens if you give eggs from substrate brooders to mouth brooders? Or if you give the young from mouth brooders to substrate brooders? You know, you wait till the two species are at the same stage in their breeding cycle and swap them over. Well, amazingly, you find that substrate brooding parents, when they find that they've suddenly got a load of young who are hitting at their mouths wanting to get in, they obediently open their mouths and seem to know exactly what to do. And similarly the other way around. And all sorts of experiments have been done like that. So you find that even species in the group which do not naturally show a particular behaviour know what it is and know how to perform it if they're called upon to do so. And again, that's typical of what you find in other kinds of animals and plants. Or not plants, but in animals. And so, in fact, I came to the conclusion, how do you know whether animals are members of the same kind? Well, you ask them. Do they recognise each other as members of the same kind? If they do, they are. If they don't, they're not. And cichlids recognise all other cichlids as cichlids and know how to reproduce any behaviour you find in the kind. I was also interested in the whole subject of heredity. What I was actually working towards, though I never got there because time ran out and I got distracted by all the other things I've been talking about. Cichlids are just delightful animals. But what I was actually interested in was heredity. I wanted to start doing some hybridization experiments, not breeding experiments, but experiments where I could take the nucleus from the egg of one species to put it into the nucleated egg cell of another species to see what happens there. So you're taking the genetics of one form together with the rest of the cell of another. And I got as far as demonstrating that one could definitely do that in cichlids and that fish were very suitable organisms to do this. And the advantage of fish is that their eggs, on the whole, are transparent. So when the fish are developing, you can follow the whole development in exquisite detail. That you can see right through them under the microscope and see all the details of the heart and the internal structures and everything else. It's quite late on in development that the pigment forms and then become opaque. So fish unlike many other organisms, are a delight to follow the early development. And I want to talk a little bit about that because I was looking at the tremendous evidence that exists that DNA is actually responsible for very little in heredity. And as Darwinism is entirely based on the assumption that DNA is the be-all and end-all in heredity, that's obviously an interesting point. What I was going to say, this is one of the main things I was interested in. I wanted to know about heredity on the assumption that there are distinct kinds of animals and plants. And of course, I was interested as a scientist in knowing what is responsible for it. What's the mechanism that guarantees their distinctiveness or that underwrites it? Just again to make the point, because if you believe in creation as opposed to evolution, that doesn't mean you don't have scientific questions you want answered. Of course you do. There are still endless things that you want to investigate. The fact that you believe in creation doesn't mean that there aren't mechanisms of heredity that you want to understand and see what's happening here. If there are limits, then what sets the limits? Why are the limits? But Darwinism is based on what I'd call genetic reductionist model of organisms. It's on the assumption that DNA is the sole carrier of information in heredity and development. And that all the characteristics of an organism are encoded in its DNA, that DNA is some kind of blueprint or recipe, and those are the kinds of words that are used. DNA is God and RNA is profit, is how my biology lecturer at Birmingham University put it, though he didn't actually believe it. And then the idea is that mutations in the DNA, base changes in the DNA at root, lead to new organisms and so explain the evolutionary descent of all living things. So clearly, if you accept that DNA model, that DNA is responsible for coding in some way all the characteristics of an organism, whether as recipe or as blueprint, then obviously you've got the basis of a theory of evolution, a scientific theory. Changes in the DNA produces changes in the organisms, etc. Everything flows from there. And yet, an unknown secret here, that neo-Darwinian paradigm has been known to be false, unquestionably false, irrefutably false, for over 50 years. I'd say the decisive year when the evidence became overwhelming was 1954. When a guy called Tracy Sonneborn published his final paper in his research after about 20 years of research. And it's all to do with what's often called cortical inheritance. So cortex is just a name given to the cell membrane, round cells, and part of the cytoplasmic structure underneath. So it's a bit of a vague term, and probably today not a terribly useful term, but that's what it was historically referring to. And in fact, until the 1930s, it was commonly believed by biologists that the genes do not determine the fundamental feature of an organism's body plan. And many developmental biologists still agree with that. And the evidence comes from lots of groups of animals, but the key group of organisms on which all the key research was done was the ciliates. That's our microscopic single-celled animals. And those of you who've ever done biology at school, university, will at least have come across paramecium, the slipper animalcule. It's microscopic. Or vorticella, or tetrahymena, or stentor. Those are some of the, probably the best known ones. So any of you who've ever done biology at school, university, you will come across at least some of those. And as you can see by looking at those pictures, they've got quite a complex cell surface structure. They're covered in tiny hairs for a start, cilia, which moves them along. And these cilia, are in patterns round the organism. That bottom left picture there just shows the rows of cilia. They've been stained to appear up. And the other picture just shows you the very complex structure of these organisms. They've got quite a complex structure, and particularly the cell surface structure. And by the 1950s, it was proven beyond doubt that the ciliate cell surface structures and their patterns were inherited independently of genes and DNA. How was this done? Quite easily. You can just perform little surgical operations on these animals and say it removes some structures, or replace them, or alter them in some way, or carefully cut out a row of cilia and put it in backwards. You can do all sorts of really not very respectful things to these little organisms, and they would heal very quickly, and then that defect was just reproduced indefinitely. The next generation would be produced with exactly the same defect. Even though you could show genetically that the DNA, the genes, the genetics had not been changed one iota. It's exactly the same as before. And yet this structure was inherited indefinitely. Well, I've said it. You could do all sorts of surgical alterations and they were inherited indefinitely. Now, first, of course, many dismissed this as a quirk of these peculiar one-cell creatures with their elaborate cell surface structures. And so these are the kind of statements you've got. An extreme departure from our standard genetic system. I think that was Levantin said that. It's a rare example. It's bizarre. It's a lunatic fringe of biology. The only significant threat to our views, that was John Maynard Smith who said that. So, leading biologists were well aware of this evidence, but dismissed it, this is just a unique thing to do with ciliates. Because, they've got this elaborate cell surface structure, and when they reproduce, each cell in some way copies onto the new one. So the structure somehow forms some kind of template that copies onto the new one. Or at least that's what was thought to happen. Until it was found, I was jumping ahead. I'll go through it in order I've got here. In fact, the evidence is overwhelming that this couldn't be the case, that this must be universal, because that ciliate cord is an elaboration of the cell membrane and cytoskeleton, but a universal feature of animal and plant cells. All cells have the structures which are at the root of this particular elaboration. And the way in which cells develop are exactly the same in unicellular and multicellular organisms. There isn't any difference. The same processes happen exactly. So you wouldn't expect them to be different. And then this is the key evidence. They then found that some ciliates form cysts. One example, their pond dries up. And when they form a cyst, all visible cell surface structures disappear. In fact, you can, cut them in half and look at them under an electron microscope, and there is no structures to be seen. They look exactly the same as any normal animal cell, just a cell membrane. And no other structures visible at all. Everything has disappeared, dissolved. And yet, the cortical inheritance still occurs. If they had a defect, a surgical defect that had been produced in the cell surface structure before they form a cyst, then after they form the cyst and come out of it again, they form a new cell with that same defect as before. So however that cell surface structure is coded, it's not coded in visible structure. It also is coded somehow at a molecular level, to not even be visible in electron microscope photographs. So there is clearly another system of heredity operating in cells. And in fact, there's plenty of evidence for a wide variety of animals and plants that such a system is there, exists and operates, and in fact is responsible for the main features of the body plan, not the genes. So, as I say, those definitive papers were produced back in the 1950s. So we've known since then that the genetic paradigm is false, that there is more to heredity than DNA. And yet stubbornly, biologists carry on so that wasn't the case. An historian of science has written a history of the whole affair. In fact, it was his PhD thesis, which was written, he did the research in the 1980s and produced a book about it all in 1987. And in 1987, he concluded this: throughout the 1960s and 1970s, the evolutionary significance of cortical inheritance was largely ignored by Darwinian evolutionists. Indeed, for the most part, it still is. And in 2005, he wrote, after 20 years, it is still ignored and not answered. Fascinating. And incidentally, I mean, it should be pretty obvious anyway that DNA can't be responsible for all of heredity. Because just think about it logically for a moment. DNA reductionism is like saying that the bumps on a CD, all right, the bumps on a CD are just like the bases in the DNA chain, create both the music and the CD player. The bumps on the CD are responsible for coding, creating the music and the CD player. Is that true? Of course not. Those bumps on the CD mean nothing without the CD player to recognize them and translate them through all its mechanisms into the music and speech that you hear. So obviously DNA encodes the building materials, but not the architect's plans. Heredity and development never start with DNA, they always start with whole cells. They never start with the bumps on the CD, you always start with the CD player and the CD. And we're going to say, so what happens if you fiddle with the DNA of an organism? Well, let's take it as a chimp. If you fiddle with a chimp's DNA, we know from the times which has been done, you only get 3 possible outcomes. Another variety of normal chimp, an abnormal chimp that's not going to survive, or a dead chimp. There's nothing else you get by fiddling with DNA. And so I'm afraid, Jurassic Park films, that is just sheer nonsense. If you try to put dinosaur DNA, even if you could get it, but you can't, if you take dinosaur DNA and put it into a chicken egg or something like that, all you will ever get is some variety of chicken. You will not get some variety of dinosaur because the DNA does not give the essential information about dinosaurs. That comes from the egg. If it's a chicken egg, you will get a variety of chicken or nothing. So, interesting question I always pose at this point. Is there a scientific theory of evolution? Because we don't yet have a scientific theory of development. We don't know how a chicken develops into an egg. Because all we have, the only thing science is working on is the DNA story. But the DNA story only tells you how you go from DNA to a bag of chemicals, all the proteins and everything else that the DNA codes for. All right, so here's this bag of chemicals, which is from a cat, this one from a dog, that one from a horse, chimp, human. How does each of those bags of chemicals become those very, very different kinds of organism? We don't know. We haven't a clue. There is no theory of development in biology. Sorry, but there isn't.
I don't think so. Is RNA plays a role in breakthrough.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, the picture at the DNA RNA level is getting more and more complicated all the time. And of course, I'm not saying that DNA and RNA do not have an essentially replaceable role to play in development. The only point I'm making here, there is more to heredity than the DNA RNA world, complex as it is. And as long as you leave out that other factor, you can't have a proper theory of development because you're leaving part of the picture out. And if you haven't got that theory of development, scientific theory of development, then of course you can't possibly have a scientific theory of evolution. There is no such thing as any scientific theory of origins yet in existence because we do not yet know enough about organisms. Until we know more about organisms, it's not possible to put forward a proper scientific theory. We're still at what Thomas Kuhn would call the pre-paradigm stage in our research and development. Now, that's not to say, let me just put one final point, then over to you. I'm not suggesting that there won't be a theory of development. Now, I don't believe that there's some mystery here that we're never going to solve. As soon as we start putting on the right spectacles and look for the right kind of evidence, I'm quite sure we'll start to come up with some real scientific theories of development. But they won't be reductionist DNA theories. All right, as I said, I told you at the beginning this was going to be a bit of a rambling evening. I wasn't really going anywhere in particular. I wanted to infuse you with these tropical fish and cichlids. I wanted to give you an insight into the way in which a theist, a Christian, might approach some of these scientific questions, and also raise some of the questions that came up for me as I was doing that research, whether it's fossils or whether it's looking at the variation in these particular fish. So I say it's just been a number of points. I've not really been trying to prove anything or go anywhere in particular, but just really to provide some kind of answer to that common complaint that if you're a Christian or theist, somehow that's going to be a science stopper. I'd say, just absolute nonsense. My belief backgrounds provoked all sorts of questions which raised all sorts of interesting findings I did in my research. In fact, I can claim at least 2 new findings when I was doing the research which gained publications. But it came entirely from me asking heretical questions rather than the sort of establishment questions that an evolutionary framework would have suggested. Okay, so I'll stop there and see where we want to go. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Has anybody